This is the two-piece collar tutorial, and for this exercise we have four pattern pieces. You have the front bodice, the back bodice, the collar stand, and the collar itself. For the collar you will cut two on fold from the fashion fabric, and cut one from the interfacing. For the collar stand, you will cut two from the fashion fabric or muslin, and cut one on fold from the interfacing. The center back, the back bodice, the center back seam is cut on fold, so you will cut one out of the garment fabric or muslin. And for the front, you will cut two from muslin or the garment fabric. And after you do that, you will proceed to notching your seams. You can snip about an eighth of an inch vertical notch to indicate the center back. And also in the front, you will notch the first line and the dashed line, which is the fold line, and you will notch over here. And then you also will notch to indicate the shoulder seam allowance and the neckline seam allowance. On this piece, you it's a good idea to do an eighth of an inch notch on top and the bottom to indicate where the center back is. And and you have two notches over here and two notches over here. This one will go to center front and this one will go to the shoulder seam. And also for the collar itself, you need also this notch is going to be matching with this notch over here, so these two will end up on top of each other. And there is a notches on these corners to indicate seam allowance. So you will the first thing you're going to do is to notch, and then after that you will interface one layer of the collar stand and one layer of the collar itself. And from there we will proceed to assembling the pattern pieces to create the collar, and then attaching the collar to the bodice. So right now we are at the ironing board, and what I'm going to do is I am going to separate the two layers, and I'll take one layer and I will attach the interfacing to the wrong side of the fabric. So I'll leave one side out of my way, and the other one I will glue or attach the interfacing to the wrong side of the fabric. So interfacing on top of the wrong side of the fabric, and I will proceed to pressing the interfacing in place. So I will end up with two layers, one that is interfaced and the other one that is not interfaced, and that's for the collar stand. And I'll put these aside, and then I'll do the same thing with the collar itself. Also I cut two layers, and in this case I will attach the interfacing to the wrong side of one of these layers. So So again, I will end up with 2 layers. One is interfaced and the other one is not interfaced. From here, we're gonna go to the sewing machine to prepare the pieces so that we can sub-assemble them to be able to attach them to the neckline of the bodices. So after I notched the pattern pieces, I am going to prepare the front and the back. So what I need from the front and the back is to attach the shoulder seam so that I have a full neckline to be able to attach the collar to that neckline. So I already notched over here and I notched here, notched for the seam allowance of the neckline, and I have the 2 layers of the front. So as soon as I am going, I removed my pieces, I mirrored my pieces, and then the back bodice is cut on fold. So what I'm going to do is I am going to lay the right side of the back on top of the right side of the front pieces, and I will pin shoulder to shoulder, matching my edges and my notches, and the same thing on this side. And I'll do the same on the other side. So right side to right side and shoulder to shoulder, edge to edge and notch to notch, and just pin. And then I'll take it to the machine and I will stitch the shoulder seam at 1/2 inch away from the edge. So I'll start by back stitching. And then I'll forward stitch until I get to the end of the shoulder seam, and I will back stitch again. So I'm aligning my and back stitch, and I'll pull again, and I'll take the neckline of this side. Back stitching beginning and end. So after doing that, I'll go to the serger. I'll go to the ironing board and I will iron the seams open, and then I'll go to the serger and serge the shoulder seams open. So I am here at the ironing board and I am going to iron my seam open. And I'm going to press the other side so that now I have a complete neckline. I will serge the seam allowances, and then I will proceed to stay stitching the neckline in the curved area. Okay, now that I serged the shoulder seam, I will proceed to stay stitching the neckline in the curved areas. So I'll go from the 3rd notch all the way to the 3rd notch on the other side. And again, when we stay stitch, we are about a 1/16 of an inch less than half an inch. So I'm starting at the third notch, and the stitch size is 1 or 1.5, and I am going to stitch all around the neck, only in the curved part, and I don't need to backstitch for this. When you come to the area where the seam allowance is, if it flips up, raise your foot and adjust the seam allowance, and then keep going. Again, I'm close again, and so I came to the third notch, and I finished my stay stitching over here, just to stay stitch the circular part of the neckline. All right, so that's that. This is the preparation for the front. One more thing that you need to do, you need to fold the built-in placket. So you have these two notches that indicate the fold line, and then you have a small notch at the beginning, and there is a notch where when this small edge is folded, it's going to end up at this notch. So let me show you that on the ironing board. So I will use the two small notches at the edge and fold in. I am so this fold in is going to be towards the wrong side of the garment, and I will finger press and then use the iron to press it in place. The second fold is going to be at the notch where the fold line on the pattern piece was, and so I notched beginning and end, and I will use these two notches to again finger press and then iron. Okay, and I'll do the same thing on the other side. So I am on the wrong side of the garment, and I will press using finger press using the beginning and end notch of the small line. It's about 1/4 of an inch, and then I'll press that in place, and then I'll use the second two notches, top and bottom, to fold back this area. Okay, so, and then I'll press it in place, and then I'll take it to the ironing board, and I will stitch number 2 stitch over top stitch this to secure and clean this edge. So I am back at the sewing machine and I am going to top stitch this fold in place so that it cannot flip anymore, so that it stays nice and fixed in place. And I'll stitch about 1/16 of an inch away from that edge. And back stitch, and so this part is done on this side, and I'll do the same thing on the other side. So from the right side of the garment, you will see that it's nice top stitching, and it's just securing that fold in place. This fold is a built-in placket that should take, in a real garment, it will take the buttons and the buttonholes. And again, I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. So I will stitch. We can back stitch at the beginning. And then I will top stitch at about 1/16 of an inch from the edge. Again, I'll trim. And now this is the actually steps for the sub-assembly of the bodice piece. So I stitched the shoulder seams, and then I pressed them open and I serged the seams, and I stay stitched the neckline and folded back to create built-in placket, and I top stitched it in place on both sides. So this is what you need to do with the front and back bodice pieces in preparation for the full assembly. The next piece we are going to sub-assemble is the collar pieces. So we have two layers, one that is interfaced and the other one that is not interfaced. In this case, I'll put the interface piece down, and then I'll add the non-interfaced piece on top of it, and it's gonna be right side to right side. And then I'll take it to the machine and I will stitch this seam over here. This edge over here is the neckline edge, and I don't need to stitch that. It can stay open. The part that needs to be stitched is the outline of the collar, so I need to stitch that at half an inch seam allowance. I will start by stitching the upper edge first and stay stitching it, and under stitching it, and then I will proceed to stitching the sides. I kind of thought about this way, doing it this way, so that it's easier to understitch. Usually what happens is you stitch all around. So you start at the neckline, you go to the corner, and then you come to this corner and go back, and then you understitch after that. It tends to be a little bit tight for the understitching, and you will do it at two steps. What I attempted before, and it worked for me, is to stitch this top seam first and then understitch it, and then I'll stitch the sides after that. To be able to do that, I need to indicate the corner, because I'm going to start and end stitching at that corner. So I will indicate the corner using the heat erasable marker. All right, and I'll do the same thing on the other side. So I'm aligning the edge of my paper, and I will mark that. An alternative to this is to do a tailor tag. Okay, and then I'll take it to the machine, and I will start. I'm aligning my edges together, and I will start stitching right at that corner. I will also add a couple of pins. So I have center to center and I'm pinning over here, and I have another notch in here that I'm going to pin so that I have control over my fabric. And then from there I will be stitching at 1/2 inch. So I'll start by stitching 3 stitches away from the corner, and then I'll back stitch these 3 stitches, and then from here I will proceed to stitching until I finish the seam at 1/2 inch away from the edge. Whenever I come to a pin, I have to remove it, and I am also matching the notches on here, and then I'll hold them with another pin, and that pin will hold these 2 corners together. And I will end where the pin is, so I'll hand crank these last few stitches, 1 more, and then I will back stitch again. And I'll trim my thread from here. I will trim the seam allowance in half. And I will understitch, which in this case I will stitch the seam allowance to the interfaced side. So again, I will be trimming the seam allowance in half. I can also grade the seam allowance, which is the side that has the interfacing. I can shave another 1/8 of an inch or so. Just one side of the seam allowance, not both. This is called grading. Okay, so I shaved about 1/8 of an inch on one side, the side that has the interfacing, and then I'll pull the interface side on top of the seam allowance, and I will understitch starting at where I started stitching. Okay, so I'm gonna go to the sewing machine, and I'll be stitching at about 1/16 of an inch away from the attachment seam. So I'll take a few stitches, and then I'll back stitch 1, 2, 3, and then from here I'll be stitching until I get to where I stopped stitching on the other side. here is where I stop, so I'll put a pin in here just to indicate where to stop, and then I'll backstitch from there. Once I get to my pin, I will backstitch. And so this is the first step in the collar assembly. Okay, now I have the collar halfway assembled, so I will fold the two pieces on top of each other again, right side together, and in this case the seam allowance will be going towards the interfaced side. Okay, so this is the interfaced side, and what I'm going to do is I will match the edges of the neckline side just to keep the edges where they are supposed to be. So that no shifts happen or anything like that. And then I will proceed to stitching. I am folding the seam allowance towards the interfaced side, and I will be stitching from the edge down at 1/2 inch. So I'll be stitching this edge, and then I'll stitch the other edge at 1/2 inch away from the edge. And I'll put another pin to hold the ends together. So I'm gonna come to my machine, and I will start at the beginning of the fold. Basically, I'll take few stitches and then back stitch, and then when I get to the end over here, I'll back stitch again. And then forward stitch until I get to the end. So this is one side, all right, and then I'll do the other side exactly the same. So I'm matching edge to edge, and I'm folding the seam allowance towards the interfaced side. Okay, and holding my edges together with a couple of pins. Okay, and in this case I will again start stitching and back stitch. Back stitch again. Now I need to trim the seam allowance in half on this side too. Okay, so I'm trimming the seam allowance, and I'm going to do the same thing over here. So I'm trimming the seam allowance in half. Okay, I can remove my pins. And I can also take this to reduce the bulk. I'll do the same thing over here. Okay, and then I'll open the collar. I will snip this at an angle to grade the seam allowance. Right, and I'll push the seam allowance towards the interfaced side, and then I'll flip it on both sides, doing the same thing. So folding the seam allowance towards the interfaced side, and I can use an awl or a pin to pull the seam allowance out so that I have a nice sharp corner. All right, and I'll do the same thing on the other side. So right? And the last thing I want to do is I want to press the collar after I finished, where the top collar is covering the seam of the attachment between the top collar and the under collar. All right, so this will be the last step in the pre-assembly of the collar. All right, so this is the preparation of the collar pieces. Now is the time to put the collar to the collar stand, and to do that I will flip the interfaced side, and I wanna, and in this case the collar will be sandwiched between the two pieces of the collar stand. What you need to pay attention to is that the interfaced side of the collar should be aligned with the interfaced side of the collar stand, and then the non-interfaced side will be on top of the collar, so that the collar is sandwiched between the two pieces. And in this case, non-interfaced to non-interfaced and interfaced to interfaced. Okay, and the collar will be flipped to the opposite side. Okay, so we need to pin this before we attach all the pieces together. So notice the shape of the collar stand, and again notice the placement of the collar itself. So I'll match center to center, center line to center line. Okay, and I'll bring this piece and I'll pin it in place. So all the center lines together, and then there is the shoulder notch, so all the shoulder notches together on the three pieces, and pin. And you're gonna do the same thing, so shoulder notch to shoulder notch in the collar on both layers, and then shoulder notch of the interfaced part of the collar stand. And pin that in place, and then you will find a notch. That's where the end of the collar should be, and then the non-interfaced side of the collar stand will be pinned. So you will match the notches to each other, and then the collar will end at that notch. And that's another point of pinning. All right, and to start stitching, I need to fold this side 1/2 inch upwards. Okay, and then so I fold it back where the notch is, the seam allowance notch is, and that's where I'm going to start the stitching. So I'll pin this one in place, and I'll do the same thing on the other side. So I'll match the edges and I'll match the notches, and I'll fold this side backwards, and I will pin it in place. And I'm going to start stitching over here. I'll go all around and I'll end at the other fold. Back stitching beginning and end. And staying at 1/2 inch seam allowance. So I'll take a few stitches forward. Back stitch, and then I'll stay at 1/2 inch until I get all the way to the other side. This curve over here is a little tight, so be very slow with it, and stay at 1/2 inch away from your edge. If you need to adjust anything, leave your needle down. And then from here, it's basically just matching the three edges together and stitching at 1/2 inch all the way to the other curve. And then I'll proceed to sewing the curve, and I'm being as slow as I can so that I get a nice gradual curve. Once I get out of the fold, I backstitched. My curves are not as good as I would like them to be, so I can fix them. I love the Juki for that. It's definitely much better than what I have in here. I will flip it out and see how it looks, and if I don't like it, I will have to fix this area before I proceed. Now that I'm happy with my stitching, I will trim my seam allowance in half, and I will wedge the corners. Be careful with your stitching line. Okay, and I'll do the same thing on the other side so that I can flip it inside out. Okay, and now I can fold it inside out. And I'll go to the ironing board and I'll press the seams away from the collar. So this is the under collar and this is the top collar. I'm going to do the same thing where I'm going to press I can see that I created a couple of puckers in here, so I need to fix that. Now I'm going to fold this edge up. So I'm the other side that I didn't fold up, I will fold it using my ironing guide. So I folded in my seam allowance and I pressed the seam inside in order to crease my seam allowance. And I will fold this side on top of it. Because I want the seam allowance of the non-interfaced side to be a little smaller than the interfaced side, so that when I stitch in the ditch, it's caught in the stitching. Okay, I did the pressing, and then I'll go back to the neckline and I will be attaching the collar with the collar stand to the neckline of the garment. Just need to press this side, just like I did with this side. Okay, so I'm ready now to attach the collar with the collar stand to the neckline of the garment. So I have the collar, this is the top collar and this is the under collar, and I am going to attach the interfaced side of the collar stand to the neckline, and then this notch goes to the shoulder, similar to what we did with the Peter Pan collar. Right, and this layer of the collar stand is out of my way, and then it's gonna be fold to fold when it comes to the edge of the front seam allowance. So the fold of the collar stand is gonna go to the fold of the placket. As you can see, the collar stand is a little bigger than the collar itself. That's why we did the stay stitching, so we can stretch the neckline to the collar size. Okay, so I notched the fabric, and then I'll proceed to pinning the collar stand to the neckline of the shirt. Right, the same situation is happening here, so I snipped the seam allowance and I am pinning to the neckline, and notch to shoulder seam on this side, and I'll pin again, and again the fold of the collar stand will go to the fold of the placket or the shirt, and edge to edge. And I'll pin this in place, and then again I'll snip the neckline and pin edge to edge. And I'm aligning the edges, and I will pin over here, and I'll do the same thing, stretching the neckline, aligning the edges, and pinning. And then from here I will proceed to stitching at 1/2 inch away from the edge. I will stitch from the shirt side so that I can see the stay stitching, and I can avoid in this case having any puckers, or also showing any of the stay stitching. So I'm gonna start stitching at 1/2 inch all the way until I get out on the other side. And again I will, as you can see here, it is fold to fold. Back stitch beginning and end, and I need to mark where I'm going to start. It's gonna be right here. Okay, the other thing that I need to avoid is I need to avoid also catching the seam allowance of the collar stand, of the other side of the collar stand, so I will actually hold it in place with a pin so that it's out of my way when I'm stitching. Okay, so I'm taking it out of my way while I'm stitching, and I will start stitching at 1/2 inch away from the edge. Back stitching. And then I'll forward stitch. And from here until I get to the end, I am going to be aligning my edges and making sure that the fabric underneath is nice and flat. Again, align your edge and keep stitching. And get any fabric out of your way. Avoid making any puckers or pleats along the way. When I come here, I need edge to edge. And once I get to the end, I'll back stitch. So I finished the stitching, and now is the time for me to inspect my stitching to make sure that I didn't cause any puckers or anything like that. If I see anything that needs to be fixed, now is the time to fix it. Everything looks good, so I can unpin the other side of the collar stand. And what I need to do is I will trim the seam allowance in half, all right, and then I'll be folding the seam allowance inside the collar, and I will be covering the attachment stitch with the layer of the collar stand that's inside the shirt, or the uninterfaced layer needs to be covering this stitching, hiding it. Okay, so when I either stitch on the ditch, or if I decide to top stitch, in this case it gets attached, it gets caught in the stitching. So again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to trim the attachment seam allowance between the neckline and the collar stand. I'll trim that in half. And I will also use the hem to press the seam allowance inside the collar stand. The hem helps a lot with curved seams, so The other thing I need to do is I need to snip this seam allowance so that it lays flatter. Okay, from here I will just fold the other side of the collar stand, and I will press it one more time before I take it to the machine and top stitch it. And what I'm doing right now is I am covering my previous attachment line with the seam allowance of the inside layer of the collar stand. I'm just making sure that I'm covering my attachment seam and pressing the seam allowance in there. If I find an area where it's not covering, I will borrow a little bit of fabric from that side to hide everything underneath. So far it looks good, and now what I'm going to do is I will go to the right side of the shirt, and I will stitch in the ditch, and that should catch the seam allowance of the inside layer. An alternative to stitching in the ditch, I can also top stitch. And what I'm doing over here is I'm inserting all the seam allowances inside, so that when I top stitch or stitch in the ditch, they get sealed and hidden inside the collar. Okay, it's a little bulky, so I may trim at an angle to reduce the bulk. I will trim one side only. That should take care of it. And from here it's just gonna be just the stitching in the ditch. I'm also going to add few pins just to hold things together and to distribute things evenly. Making sure that I'm covering my attachment stitches, and that will control the whole seam. Alright, and then I'll go to the right side of the garment and I will be stitching in the ditch. So right now I'm stitching in the ditch, back stitching beginning and end. I already back stitched, so I'm just going to stitch in the ditch from here, removing my pins as I go. And while I'm stitching in the ditch, as you can see, I am pulling on the seams to keep them away from each other, and once I release my fingers, they kind of overlap and hide my stitching. And I'm going to inspect my stitching on the inside. It caught everything. It doesn't look the best, but it caught everything it needs to catch. So while I'm removing my pins, I'm also making sure that my attachment seam is hidden. So I'm making sure that the seam, the folded edge is covering my previous stitch. Okay, so I'm making sure that the previous stitch is covered while right before I stitch in the edge. Once I get to my last stitch, I will back stitch. And done. And here is the final product. I will inspect if there is any area that's not caught. I will fix that. Another option is to also attach this by hand by doing a blind stitch. Okay. All right. So here is the final result, and I can fold back the collar. And I see some areas that did not catch, so I will be fixing that off the camera. But here is the finished product. And I'll see you in class to show it to you live.